So I thought I'd lay out a quick commentary on why we need Assyria Total War, and this obviously comes in the light of the very underwhelming Total War Pharaoh. And yes, I am something of an Assyria fanboy, but I think that this would be the best Total War game since Rome, because of the place, the time, and the diversity of things. If you set it right and got it right, and actually a lot of what Pharaoh has done is a good step in that direction, right? So there's a question of why is Rome Total War set around 272 BC? This is, of course, shortly after the death of Alexander the Great, and it's because the world is controlled by a plurality of powerful states. There are lots of interesting political events going on. There are technological developments, there are political developments, there are military developments. A lot of stuff is going on, and it's not evident to the people at the time what's actually going to happen. It could have gone either way for almost anyone involved. And Assyria, in somewhere between 900 to 800 BC, is actually very similar. As you can see looking at a map, you have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Israelites and the Kingdom of Judah, and the Syrian cities in the Fertile Crescent as the kind of heartland. And this, of course, goes down into Egypt, and then in Anatolia you have Phrygians and Neo-Hittites and various other types. And then to the north of that, you have a bunch of very strange barbarians called the Urartu, and there are a few other types whose names escaped me. And then to the east, you've got the horse-riding Medes and Persians. And then in the south, you've got the Aramaeans and what become the Arabs. So you've got a very wide selection of actually different cultures that are coming into contact. The Phrygians and the Neo-Hittites are sort of Indo-European types. The Urartians are like primitive mountain people, as far as we know. The Medes are, of course, nomadic horse riders. The Elamites are a sort of ancient settled civilization. The Aramaeans are, again, primitive nomads. You've got the culture of Egypt, which is, of course, very old. And also you've got the Philistines there, which kind of, I believe, represent the sort of Peliset that were resettled by Ramses III after the Sea People's invasion. So they're essentially kind of Greeks. And you could, of course, extend the map to the east or the west to include the Greek city-states in 800 BC, who, as we understand, did do hoplite warfare. It would have been fairly primitive at the time, but at least you would have had that there. And to the east, you would have had India and various steppe peoples. So you've got a very broad selection of peoples, which is very interesting. So, and lots of interesting and powerful places are apparent. And this presents a vast amount of military diversity. I mean, Assyria itself has archers, slingers, skirmishers, light troops, heavy troops, chariots, cavalry, and a really wide and creative variety of siege engines. But there are also things like camel cavalry and war elephants that are used in this period too. In fact, if you went to, say, 600 BC, so if you had like a 200 year time span, you arrive at the sort of period of Cyrus the Great defeating the Lydians with his camels and things like that. So you do have a really, really broad amount of military diversity, and there's no particular reason that you couldn't make these all available. Politically, this is the era of like mega dynastic struggles, because religion is intimately bound up with every aspect of each people's lives. So, I mean, in Egypt, you of course have the pharaonic god king, but in Assyria, you have the king of kings, the king of the four quarters of the earth, put in his place by Ashur, by the divine god of Assyria. But all of them thought that their particular patron deity, and each city has a patron deity, and the success of the city indicated the success of the god, And so you could have an important layer of religion overlaid on these things. And you can have really interesting events. For example, if you take a city, one of the common things to do to disgrace that city was to capture the idols of their gods and march them back and prostrate them at the feet of your god in their great temple. And this leads us on to another point. Massive architecture. Something that the people of this time period did is build wonders. In fact, a lot of the wonders of the world were built in and around this sort of time period. You had huge ziggurats, which of course have pyramids, and then you have giant palaces, and you have hanging gardens, which is shortly after this period. And so mighty and impressive wonders are definitely something that they did. And this all ties together to create a world that is kind of vital, that wants to explode and build and become something really important. And on that note, and towards that end, trade is massively important, because actually the regions are really interestingly split up when it comes to resources themselves. For example, in Mesopotamia, there wasn't much of anything apart from clay and grain. And if that's really all you've got access to, you've got to get stone from the Zagros Mountains. You've got to get tin and copper from... Copper is relatively easy to get access to, so any mountain range will probably have copper. But the tin came from Afghanistan, so I mean, like, having that on the map would be very interesting, and having tribal confederacies of Afghans getting rich selling tin would be great, because that's what they did. And this, if you combine that with the sort of Pharaoh Troy-style resource gathering, resource management, then actually you're onto a bit of a winner there, because this would represent how the region operated. I mean, one of the things that the people of Mesopotamia did, the reason that this is featured so prominently in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that the conquest of Lebanon is important to get access to cedar, as in really strong hardwood that is really useful and can be made into, you know, great palaces and doors and things like gates. And this is something that the Assyrian kings went west for all the time. There was a reason for them to go there and use the Tigris and Euphrates as a trade lifeline to send these things back to Assyria so they could build amazing buildings, which they did. Another thing that was interesting in this time is population movement. In Rome and medieval too, but I think it was really Rome that only had this, where you could raise men out of a population of a city and then disband them in a different city to move the population. Some kind of feature like that would be good, because again, this is what the Assyrians did all the time, and this should have an effect on the places that are devastated and depopulated, and the places the population is taken to. It should also be that you have some kind of rules or mechanics around standing armies versus seasonal armies, as in you raise a large number of not great soldiers, or you have a smaller number of really elite soldiers who obviously cost a lot more but can fight all year round. This would be a great mechanic, because this is really what happened. Again, this is the sort of time where Tiglath-Pileser II actually creates the first really professional military in the world, at least since Sargon the Great. So it would actually be something really interesting. And well, obviously, it was in reality Assyria that did this. Egypt, I think, had a standing military as well. But you would have these as mechanics that were available to essentially anyone, because, of course, you don't want it to just be fanboy for Assyria. You want other factions to be able to rise to the point of greatness that Assyria was able to achieve, and technological military. And so this is the era where the classical world is being formed, right? This is where things that we take for granted later become normalized and are invented, and there's a lot going on that it's really exciting. You've got really savage barbarians on the outlands, so you can have massive barbarian invasions, because this happened. The Sumerians are a great example of a kind of really savage, barbaric steppe people who are just this massive whirlwind of a barbarian invasion, and Sargon II, the Assyrian king, dies in battle trying to fend them off, when he wasn't going around terrorizing everyone for tribute. Oh yeah, that's another thing as well. You could have mechanics for tribute, as in, if you turn up at a city with a massive, powerful army, they may well just choose to pay tribute, so you go on your way, and essentially pay tribute as a vassal, but this could be broken any time, as someone like Hezekiah of Judah, Judah shows that this is not guaranteed. If they think their position is strong enough, then they'll refuse to pay the tribute, and so they'll be essentially a rebel province. But basically, there's loads and loads of really exciting stuff that could be done at this time, and would create the kind of diversity that made Rome Medieval 2 really, really good. And given the very disappointing nature of Pharaoh, I think it's probably, like, Pharaoh was just set too early. 1400 BC is not a very exciting time. I mean, it is, but like for a wargame player, because a lot of things that we take for granted just hasn't been invented at that point, but it's all invented around 900 to 800 BC, were the sort of first examples of it. And another great thing as well is we move into the Iron Age here, right? So in the early game, you're using bronze and you're using chariots, but by the late game, you'll be using iron and you'll be riding horses from the main sort of civilized factions. But then you would have the Medes, who would have horses from the beginning, because they began, like the steppe peoples were riding horses long before the civilized peoples in Mesopotamia. So, and the use of iron would probably come quite late to these horse cultures as well. They would definitely been using bronze, but like iron's more difficult to smelt, and so you would need proper professionals to do it. So you could have interesting technological inversions and things like that, and you could have these having a real effect. Like, there's a reason that they used iron weapons. It's because technically they're just better than bronze, and they're easier to produce as well. So, but it's not that bronze weapons aren't good or useful, obviously. It's just you would prefer to have iron given the choice. And the Assyrians were basically like the men of iron of their day. They were, their heavy troops were just so good. So anyway, that's just my case for Assyria Total War. Of course, I expect Creative Assembly to not do that at all and just continue bungling on and making mistake after mistake and running their franchise into the ground despite the prodigious goodwill that people have for it. But that's what I'd like to see. Let me know what you think in the comments.